Most people don't fail because they're not capable. They fail because they never take control of the one thing that decides everything: their mind. Think about your last few days. How many decisions did you actually make consciously? And how many just happened? You wake up, you scroll, you delay. You tell yourself you'll start later. Not because you're lazy, but because something in your mind is already deciding for you. Quietly, consistently. And the worst part, it feels normal. That's how people stay stuck for years without even realizing they're stuck. They wait for motivation. They wait for the right moment. They wait until they feel ready. But that moment rarely comes. So nothing really changes. If you're being honest, you felt it too. That gap between what you know you're capable of and what you actually do. That quiet frustration. That feeling that you should be further ahead by now. This audiobook isn't here to motivate you for a few minutes. It's here to show you something deeper, something most people avoid seeing. Because once you see it clearly, you can't go back to thinking the same way. So don't just listen. Pay attention. Because what you're about to hear might explain why you've been stuck and what it actually takes to change it. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The invisible prison you live in. You probably didn't notice when it started. It wasn't dramatic, no big moment, no clear shift. Just small things, repeated often enough that they became invisible. You wake up in the morning, your hand reaches for your phone before your mind fully wakes up. A quick scroll, a few headlines. Someone else's life, someone else's success, someone else's opinion, slipping quietly into your head before you've even had a chance to think your own thoughts. It feels harmless. That's the problem, because by the time you actually get out of bed, something inside you has already been shaped, slightly, subtly, enough to matter. And then the day begins. You move through familiar routines, same reactions, same patterns. You say the same kind of things, think the same kind of thoughts, avoid the same kind of risks. It all feels normal, predictable, even comfortable. But if you slow down, really slow down, and pay attention, something starts to feel off. Not wrong exactly, just repetitive. Like you've been here before. Not just in a general sense, but in a very specific, almost scripted way. The same doubts showing up at the same moments, the same hesitation right when you're about to step outside your comfort zone. It's subtle, easy to ignore. Most people do ignore it, because questioning it would mean questioning yourself, and that's uncomfortable in a way most people would rather avoid. So instead, you accept it. You call it personality. You call it just the way I am. You build a quiet agreement with it without even realizing you've signed anything. And over time, that agreement starts to shape your life. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. What if a large part of what you call you isn't actually you? Not consciously chosen, at least. Think about your reactions, the way you instinctively pull back from certain opportunities, the quick conclusions you jump to, the silent assumptions you make about what's possible for you and what isn't. Those didn't appear out of nowhere. They were built, piece by piece. A moment when something didn't go your way, a comment that stayed with you longer than it should have, a time you tried and failed, and your brain quietly decided, let's not do that again. At first, it made sense. Your brain is designed to protect you, to keep you safe from pain, embarrassment, rejection. It notices patterns quickly and builds shortcuts so you don't have to relearn the same lesson twice. That's efficient. It's also limiting. Because over time, those shortcuts stop being helpful guidelines and start becoming boundaries, invisible ones.
You don't try certain things, not because you've carefully evaluated them, but because something in you already decided how it will end. You don't speak up, not because you have nothing to say, but because a quiet voice suggests it's better to stay silent. And the strange part, that voice sounds like you. So you trust it. You rarely question it. Why would you? It feels familiar, consistent, almost comforting in its certainty. But familiarity doesn't always mean truth. Sometimes it just means repetition. And repetition over time becomes identity. That's how the invisible prison is built. Not with force, not with rules written down anywhere, just with patterns that go unchallenged for long enough that they start to feel permanent. You live inside it without realizing you're inside anything at all. From the outside, everything looks fine. You're functioning, you're getting through your days, maybe even doing okay by most standards. But there's a difference between functioning and actually living with intention. A quiet difference. One that shows up in moments you don't always talk about. Like when you feel a brief spark of ambition and then immediately talk yourself out of it. Or when you see someone doing something you once wanted to try, and instead of feeling inspired, you feel a subtle sense of distance, like that path belongs to them, not you. You don't say it out loud, but you feel it. And over time, those small moments add up. They shape the choices you make, the risks you avoid, the direction your life slowly, almost invisibly takes. This is what average often looks like. Not failure, not struggle, just a kind of quiet settling. You do what's expected. You stay within reasonable limits. You avoid major mistakes. And in doing so, you also avoid major growth. It doesn't feel like a loss, at least not immediately. That's what makes it dangerous, because there's no clear signal telling you something is wrong, no alarm going off, just a slow drift in a direction you never consciously chose.
Years pass like this. You get better at your routines, more efficient, more certain about who you are. But that certainty comes with a cost. It locks things in place. It turns possibilities into not for me. And once that belief settles in, it's hard to even notice it, let alone challenge it. This is where most people stay. Not because they lack potential, not because they don't want more, but because they never question the system running in the background. They never pause long enough to ask, wait, why do I think this way? And that question matters more than it seems, because the moment you ask it, really ask it, without brushing it aside, you create a small crack in that invisible structure. Just a crack, but it's enough. Enough to let a different thought in. Enough to see that maybe, just maybe, not everything in your mind is fixed. That maybe some of it can be examined, adjusted, even changed. It doesn't happen all at once. In fact, at first, it can feel unsettling. Because if your thoughts aren't entirely reliable, then what are you supposed to trust? That uncertainty can be uncomfortable, but it's also where something important begins. Awareness. Real awareness, not the surface-level kind, but the kind that makes you pause in the middle of a familiar reaction and think, why am I doing this? That pause is powerful, more powerful than it looks, because for the first time, you're not just following the pattern, you're observing it. And observation creates distance, a small gap between you and the automatic response. Inside that gap, there's choice. Not a loud, dramatic choice, nothing that instantly changes everything. Just a quiet option. To respond differently. To question the assumption instead of accepting it. To try, even if a part of you is convinced it won't work. At first, it feels unnatural, almost forced.
Your mind will push back. It will offer familiar arguments, remind you of past outcomes, suggest that it's safer to stay where you are. That's expected. Those patterns have been there for years, maybe longer. They don't disappear just because you noticed them once. But noticing is where it starts. Without that, nothing changes. You remain inside the same loops, living out the same mental scripts, calling it normal because you've never seen anything else. And maybe that's the most important point. You can't change what you don't see. But once you see it, even briefly, you can't completely ignore it anymore. Something shifts. A question lingers. A quiet sense that there might be more control here than you thought. Not full control, not instantly, but enough to matter. Enough to begin. And that brings you to a simple, uncomfortable realization. If your current way of thinking has been shaped over time, then it can also be reshaped. Not easily, not quickly, but deliberately. Which means the life you're living right now, the choices, the limits, the direction, isn't just happening to you. It's being guided, quietly, consistently, by patterns you didn't question. Until now. So the real question isn't whether this invisible prison exists. It's whether you're willing to see it clearly, and then decide what to do next.
Chapter 2. Why Your Brain Resists Growth. You've probably felt it before. That brief moment when you decide, almost out of nowhere, I'm going to change something. Maybe you'll wake up earlier. Maybe you'll start that project you've been putting off. Maybe you'll finally become the kind of person you keep imagining in your head. For a few minutes, sometimes even a few hours, it feels real, clear, possible. And then something shifts. Not loudly, not in a way you can point to, just a quiet resistance. You hesitate. You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow. You get distracted by something small, or you suddenly feel tired in a way that doesn't quite make sense. And just like that, the moment passes. It's frustrating, isn't it? Because a part of you knows you meant it. That version of you, the one who wanted to change, felt genuine. It wasn't fake motivation. It wasn't forced. So why does it keep slipping away? Why does your own mind seem to pull you back just when you're about to move forward? The easy answer is laziness, but that answer is wrong, or at least incomplete. What's actually happening is more subtle. Your brain isn't trying to make you fail. It's trying to keep things the same. And from its perspective, that makes perfect sense. Your brain is built for efficiency. It prefers patterns it already understands. Familiar routines require less energy, less attention, less risk. Once something becomes habitual, your brain can run it in the background without much effort. Change, on the other hand, is expensive. It demands focus. It introduces uncertainty. It forces your brain to process new information, make new decisions, and face outcomes it can't fully predict. And your brain doesn't like that. Not because it's against you, but because uncertainty, in a deeper sense, feels like danger. Even if that danger is just trying something new, speaking up in a meeting, or stepping into a role you've never played before. To your conscious mind, it might look like growth. To your brain, it often looks like risk. So it responds the way it's designed to respond. It slows you down. It introduces doubt. It whispers things that sound reasonable on the surface. Maybe now isn't the right time. You should prepare more first. What if it doesn't work? None of these thoughts are obviously wrong. That's what makes them effective. They don't feel like sabotage. They feel like caution. And caution, in small amounts, is useful. But when it becomes your default response to anything unfamiliar, it quietly starts shaping your life in ways you don't immediately notice. You begin to avoid discomfort, not just physical discomfort, but mental discomfort. The discomfort of not knowing, the discomfort of possibly failing, the discomfort of being seen trying something and not doing it perfectly. And here's the part most people overlook. Your brain learns from what you avoid. Every time you back away from something challenging, your brain takes note. It registers that situation as something to be careful around in the future. It strengthens the connection between "this feels uncomfortable" and "we should not do this." Over time, those connections get stronger, more automatic. What once felt like a small hesitation becomes a near-instant decision. You don't even think about it anymore. You just don't try. And because you don't try, nothing contradicts that internal belief. There's no new evidence, no new experience to prove your brain wrong. So the pattern stays intact, reinforced. This is how resistance becomes part of your identity. You start describing yourself in ways that match these patterns. "I'm not the kind of person who does that. I'm just not disciplined. I've always been like this." Those statements feel honest, but they're built on repeated avoidance, not fixed truth. And once you believe them, they become harder to challenge. Because now it's not just about changing a behavior, it's about changing how you see yourself. That's a much deeper shift, and your brain resists that even more. There's another layer to this: comfort. It's easy to think of comfort as something positive, something you've earned, a place where you can relax without pressure. And in some contexts, that's true. But comfort has a hidden side. It narrows your range. When you stay within what's comfortable, you limit the situations you expose yourself to. You repeat what you already know. You operate within a predictable set of outcomes. Nothing surprises you. Nothing stretches you. At first, that feels stable. Then, slowly, it starts to feel small. You might not even notice it consciously, just a subtle sense that something is missing, that you're capable of more, but you can't quite access it. And the frustrating part is, you're right. You are capable of more. But capability doesn't matter if your mind keeps steering you back to what's familiar. This is where most people get stuck. They wait for motivation. They think if they just feel inspired enough, the resistance will disappear. But motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes. Some days it's strong. Most days it's not. And your brain knows that. So it waits. It lets the motivation fade. And once it does, it brings you back to your usual patterns. This cycle repeats so often that it starts to feel permanent, like you're caught between wanting more and never quite acting on it. But here's what's worth paying attention to. That resistance you feel, it's not random, it's predictable. It shows up at the edge of change, right at the moment where something unfamiliar begins. That means it's not a sign to stop. It's a signal that you're getting close to something that matters. Most people misread it. They interpret resistance as a warning, something to avoid. But if you look at it differently, it starts to take on a new meaning. It becomes an indicator, a marker that you're stepping outside the patterns your brain has already mapped. And yes, that feels uncomfortable. It's supposed to. You're asking your mind to operate in a way it's not used to. Of course it's going to push back. The mistake is expecting it not to. The moment you stop expecting resistance to disappear and start expecting it to show up, you gain a different kind of control. You're no longer surprised by it. You don't interpret it as failure. You recognize it for what it is. A natural response to change, and that changes how you react. Instead of pulling back, you pause. You notice the thought, maybe I should wait. And instead of immediately agreeing with it, you question it. Not aggressively, just enough to create space. Or maybe this is exactly the moment I shouldn't wait. That small shift matters, because now you're not automatically obeying the pattern, you're interrupting it. At first, that interruption feels weak, like it's not enough to make a difference, but over time it builds. Each moment you act despite resistance, you give your brain new information, new evidence. You show it that discomfort doesn't always lead to negative outcomes, that uncertainty can be navigated, that effort doesn't always end in failure. Slowly, the pattern begins to adjust. Not completely, not immediately, but enough. Enough to make the next attempt slightly easier, and the one after that. This is how change actually happens, not through sudden transformation, but through repeated moments where you choose differently, even when it feels unnatural. Especially when it feels unnatural. Because that's where the old patterns are weakest. They rely on you staying automatic. The moment you become aware and act anyway, you start to take back control. It's not dramatic. It won't feel like a breakthrough. Most of the time, it will feel quiet, almost insignificant. But those small shifts repeated over time begin to reshape how your mind responds. And eventually, what once felt uncomfortable starts to feel familiar. That's the turning point. When growth becomes less about forcing yourself and more about becoming someone who naturally leans into challenge instead of avoiding it. But that doesn't happen by accident. It starts with understanding one simple thing. Your brain will resist change. Not because you're incapable, but because you're human. And once you understand that, you stop fighting the wrong battle. You stop waiting for the resistance to go away, and you start moving forward anyway.
It doesn't feel like you're losing anything. That's what makes it dangerous. There's no dramatic collapse, no moment where everything falls apart and forces you to wake up. Life just continues. You get through your days, handle what's in front of you, maybe even feel a sense of progress here and there. On the surface, it looks fine, and for a while, that's enough. But if you pay close attention, there's a quieter story unfolding underneath all of that, one you don't always notice in the moment. It shows up in small decisions, the opportunities you don't take because they feel slightly out of reach, the conversations you avoid because you don't want to say the wrong thing, the ideas you keep to yourself because you're not sure they're good enough. None of these moments seem important on their own. They're easy to dismiss. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that there will be other chances, that you'll be more ready next time. And maybe there will be. But here's the part most people don't stop to consider. Those small decisions don't disappear. They stack. Quietly, consistently, over time. One missed chance doesn't change your life, but a pattern of hesitation does. It shapes the direction you move in, even if you never consciously choose that direction. And the strange thing is, you won't feel it happening, not right away, because nothing is obviously wrong. You're not failing. You're not falling behind in a way that's easy to measure. You're just staying within a certain range, a safe range, a predictable one. That's where mental weakness does its best work. Not in dramatic moments, but in the everyday ones you barely notice. It convinces you to take the easier option, again and again. And over time, those easier options become your default. You start to choose comfort without thinking about it. You avoid effort without questioning it. You stay where things feel manageable, even if they're not fulfilling. At first, it feels like balance, like you're being realistic, practical, sensible.
But there's a subtle shift that happens when this becomes your pattern. Your world starts to shrink, not physically, but mentally. The range of things you consider possible gets smaller. The risks you're willing to take become more limited. The version of yourself you imagine becomes more restrained. You don't aim as high, not because you can't, but because something inside you suggests it's not worth trying. And the longer that voice goes unchallenged, the more convincing it becomes. Eventually, it doesn't even feel like doubt anymore. It feels like truth. I'm just not that kind of person. I don't have what it takes. It's too late for me to change. These thoughts don't feel emotional. They feel logical, reasonable even. And that's what makes them so hard to break. Because you're not arguing with a loud, obvious fear. You're agreeing with a calm, familiar conclusion. But that conclusion is built on limited experience, on repeated avoidance, on a version of reality where you never fully tested your own potential. That's the cost. Not something you can easily measure, but something you feel over time. It shows up in moments when you wonder what could have happened if you had pushed a little further, when you see someone else doing something you once considered and you feel a mix of curiosity and distance. Not jealousy exactly, just a quiet awareness that you stepped away from something without fully realizing it, and now it feels farther away. This is where regret begins, not as a sharp pain, but as a slow realization, a recognition that your life didn't turn out the way it could have, not because of a single mistake, but because of a pattern you never interrupted. That realization can be uncomfortable. Most people avoid it.
They distract themselves, stay busy, fill their time with things that keep them from thinking too deeply about where they're headed. And it works, for a while. But the feeling doesn't go away completely. It lingers in quiet moments, late at night, when you're alone with your thoughts and there's nothing to distract you. You start to ask questions you don't usually ask. Is this it? Am I actually satisfied? Did I settle without realizing it? Those questions don't always have clear answers, but the fact that they come up at all is important, because they point to something deeper, a gap between the life you're living and the life you sense is possible. Mental weakness widens that gap, not because you lack strength in an obvious way, but because you've trained yourself, without realizing it, to avoid the very things that would close it: effort, discomfort, uncertainty. The things that feel difficult in the short term are often the ones that expand your life in the long term. But when you consistently avoid them, the opposite happens. Your life becomes easier to manage and harder to grow. That trade-off doesn't feel significant at first. In fact, it can feel like you're doing the smart thing. Why struggle if you don't have to? Why take risks when things are already okay? Those are reasonable questions, but they lead to a very specific outcome. A life that stays within limits you never consciously chose. And over time, those limits start to feel permanent. That's when people begin to say things like, "It's too late now." Not because it's actually too late, but because they've spent so long operating within a narrow range that stepping outside of it feels almost impossible. The gap between where they are and where they could be seems too large, too uncomfortable to cross. So they stay where they are, not because they want to, but because it feels easier than confronting the effort required to change. And that's the quiet tragedy of it. Not failure, not loss in the traditional sense, just a life that never fully expands, a version of you that never fully develops, potential that stays unused, not because it wasn't there, but because it was never pushed far enough to reveal itself.
If you're being honest, you've probably felt a glimpse of that potential before, in moments where you surprised yourself, where you did something slightly outside your comfort zone and realized you were capable of more than you expected. Those moments matter because they show you something real, something that contradicts the limited version of yourself you've been operating within. But if you don't build on them, they fade. They become memories instead of turning points, and your usual patterns take over again. That's the cost of not training your mind. Not immediate pain, but gradual limitation, a slow narrowing of what you attempt, what you believe, and ultimately, what you become. The question isn't whether that process is happening. It is, for everyone. The only difference is whether you notice it and decide to interrupt it. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't pretend it's not there. You can still ignore it, but it won't feel the same. There will always be a part of you that knows that the life you're living is shaped by choices you didn't fully examine, knows that something more is possible, even if you're not sure exactly what it looks like. And that awareness, uncomfortable as it is where things start to change. Not all at once, but enough to make the next decision matter a little more than the last. Enough to make you pause before choosing the easier path again. Enough to ask yourself a different question. If I keep thinking and acting this way, where does it actually lead? And more importantly, am I okay with that? Chapter 4. Rewriting the voice inside your head. There's a voice in your head that never really goes silent. You've heard it your whole life, so you don't question it much. It comments on what you do, predicts what might happen, judges what already happened. Sometimes it's loud. Most of the time it's subtle, just a quiet stream of thoughts running in the background. And because it's always been there, it feels like you. That's the part that's easy to miss. Not every thought you hear is a decision you've made. A lot of it is inherited, repeated, or built for moments you barely remember. Still, it shapes everything. The way you see yourself, the way you interpret situations, the way you decide what's worth trying and what isn't. It's not just noise, it's direction. Think about the last time you were about to do something unfamiliar, something that mattered even a little. Maybe you were about to speak up, take a risk, or start something new. Before you acted, there was a thought, quick, almost automatic. Don't mess this up. Or maybe, you're not ready for this. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it just appears, calm and certain. And more often than not, you listen. Not because you consciously agree, but because it feels familiar, like a reasonable assessment, like a voice that's trying to keep you safe. But if you slow down and really examine it, something becomes clear. That voice isn't always accurate. It's consistent, yes, convincing, definitely, but accurate? Not necessarily. It's built from past experiences, some real, some exaggerated, some misunderstood. A moment where you struggled becomes a general rule. A single failure becomes a quiet expectation. Over time, these fragments connect and form a narrative, a story about who you are. And once that story settles in, your mind starts filtering everything through that internal voice. You don't just experience life, you interpret it through that internal voice. If the voice leans negative, you notice more evidence that confirms it. You remember your mistakes more clearly than your progress. You downplay your wins, but hold on to your failures. Not intentionally, it just happens. That's how powerful that internal dialogue is. It doesn't just reflect reality, it shapes it. And here's where it becomes a problem. If that voice has been left unchecked for years, it's probably not working in your favor. Not completely. It might be keeping you cautious, grounded, realistic, but it could also be limiting you in ways you've accepted as normal. You might be more critical of yourself than you realize, more doubtful than necessary, more likely to assume things won't work out before you've even tried. And because this voice feels like you, it's hard to separate yourself from it. You don't think, this is just a thought. You think, this is the truth. That's the trap. But once you start paying attention, something interesting happens. You begin to notice patterns, the same types of thoughts showing up in similar situations, the same tone, the same assumptions. It's almost like your mind is running a script, and scripts can be rewritten. Not instantly, not perfectly, but deliberately. The first step isn't changing the voice, it's noticing it. Really noticing it. Not just when it's loud, but when it's subtle, when it quietly influences your decisions without demanding your attention. Like when you dismiss an idea before exploring it, or when you assume someone else is more capable than you, or when you tell yourself, I'll do it later, even though you know that usually means you won't. These moments matter.
These moments matter because they reveal the underlying pattern. And once you see the pattern, you create a gap, a small space between the thought and your response. Inside that space, you have something you didn't have before. Choice. At first, it doesn't feel like much. The thought still appears. It still feels convincing. But now, instead of immediately accepting it, you can pause. You can question it. Not aggressively, not like you're trying to force a positive thought over a negative one, just curiously. Is that actually true? Or is that just what I've been telling myself? That question alone can shift something. It doesn't erase the thought, it just weakens its authority. It reminds you that this voice isn't an absolute source of truth. It's a collection of past impressions trying to guide you based on what it already knows. And what it knows is limited. It doesn't account for growth. It doesn't update itself automatically. If you never challenge it, it keeps repeating the same conclusions even when they no longer apply. That's why rewriting it matters. Not by silencing it, but by changing how you respond to it. When a limiting thought appears, you don't need to fight it. You just need to introduce a different perspective. Something that expands the possibility, even slightly. Instead of, I can't do this, maybe it becomes, I haven't done this yet. It sounds simple, almost too simple. But that shift from a fixed statement to an open one changes how your mind approaches the situation. It creates room. Room to try, room to learn, room to fail without turning that failure into identity. And that's where real change begins. Not in dramatic affirmations or forced positivity, but in small, consistent adjustments to the way you interpret your own thoughts. Over time, those adjustments add up. The voice in your head starts to sound different, less harsh, less absolute, more flexible. It still warns you sometimes, it still points out risks, but it doesn't shut you down as quickly. It becomes less of a barrier and more of a guide. That shift takes time. There will be moments where the old patterns come back strong, where the familiar doubts feel just as convincing as they always have. That's normal. Those patterns were built over years. They don't disappear in a few days. But each time you notice them and choose not to fully believe them, you weaken their hold. You create a new pattern. One where your thoughts don't automatically control your actions. One where you have a say in how you interpret what's happening inside your own mind. That's a different level of control. Not control over every thought, but control over which thoughts you follow. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because your life isn't shaped by every thought you have. It's shaped by the ones you act on. So if you can change which thoughts you listen to, you start to change the direction you move in. Slowly, quietly, but consistently. And eventually, something shifts. You stop seeing yourself as someone who is limited by their thinking and start seeing yourself as someone who can shape it. That doesn't make things easy, but it makes them possible. And sometimes, that's the only difference that matters.
Chapter 5. Discipline, the skill nobody wants to build. Most people say they want discipline, but if you watch closely, what they really want is the result of discipline, without going through the part that makes it work. They want consistency without discomfort, progress without friction, growth without having to override how they feel in the moment. And that's where things fall apart. Because discipline doesn't begin when you feel ready. It begins right at the point where you don't. Think about it. The moments that actually matter, the ones that shape your direction, rarely show up when you're motivated. They show up when you're tired, distracted, or just not in the mood. That's when the real decision happens. Not the big, dramatic kind, just a quiet choice. Do you follow how you feel, or do you follow what you said you would do? Most of the time, people follow how they feel. It's immediate, it's easier. It requires no internal resistance. If you're tired, you rest. If something feels difficult, you postpone it. If you're unsure, you avoid it. There's nothing obviously wrong with that. In fact, it feels natural. But when that becomes your default, something subtle starts to happen. Your actions become dependent on your mood, and your mood is unpredictable. Some days you'll do what you planned. Most days you won't. Not because you're incapable, but because you're waiting for the right feeling to show up first. And that feeling isn't reliable. Discipline works differently. It doesn't ask how you feel. It asks what matters. And then it expects you to act based on that, regardless of whether you're comfortable doing it. That's why it's difficult. Not because the actions themselves are always hard, but because you're going against your immediate preference. You're choosing long-term direction over short-term comfort. And your mind doesn't like that at first. It pushes back. It offers alternatives. You can skip today. It won't make a difference. You'll do it properly tomorrow. Again, these thoughts don't feel like excuses. They feel reasonable. But they all lead to the same outcome: delay. And delay, repeated often enough, becomes your pattern. That's why discipline isn't about intensity. It's about consistency. Small actions repeated even when you don't feel like it. That's it. Not perfect effort, not constant motivation, just the ability to follow through, especially when it would be easier not to. At first, it feels forced. You have to remind yourself, push yourself, almost argue with your own mind just to do something simple. That's normal. You're trying to break a pattern where your actions have always followed your feelings. Now, you're reversing that. You're saying, even if I don't feel like it, I'm still doing this. And that creates friction. But that friction is part of the process. It's not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something is changing. Most people avoid that feeling. They interpret it as resistance, as a signal to stop or wait. But in reality, it's the exact point where discipline starts to develop. Because every time you act despite that resistance, you strengthen something. Not just your behavior, but your identity. You start to see yourself differently. More than the action itself. Because once your identity begins to change, your behavior becomes more natural. You don't have to convince yourself as much. You don't have to rely on motivation. You just do the thing you decided to do, even on days when it feels inconvenient. Especially on those days.
That's where discipline separates itself from everything else. It shows up when nothing else does. No excitement, no urgency, no external pressure. Just a quiet commitment you made to yourself, and the decision to honor it. There's another side to this that people don't talk about enough. Discipline builds trust, not with others, with yourself. Every time you say you're going to do something and then follow through, you reinforce a simple belief: I can rely on myself. That belief is powerful. Because once you trust yourself, your confidence stops depending on outcomes. It's no longer about whether something works perfectly. It's about knowing you'll show up and handle whatever happens. Without that trust, everything feels uncertain. You hesitate more. You second-guess your decisions. You look for external validation before taking action. But when that trust is there, something changes. You move differently, more directly, more decisively. Not because you're sure everything will work out, but because you're sure you'll deal with it if it doesn't. And that confidence comes from discipline, from repeated proof that you can do what you said you would do, even when it wasn't convenient. It doesn't require big actions. In fact, it works better with small ones. Simple commitments you can actually keep. Wake up at a certain time. Complete a task you've been avoiding. Spend a focused hour on something that matters. Nothing impressive, but consistent. Because consistency is what rewires your behavior. It turns effort into habit. And once something becomes a habit, it requires less energy, less resistance. That's when things start to feel different. Not easy, but easier. You no longer rely on bursts of motivation to get started. You have a baseline, a standard you operate from, and over time, that standard rises. You expect more from yourself, not in a harsh or overwhelming way, but in a steady, grounded way. You don't negotiate with every decision. You don't ask, do I feel like doing this? You ask, is this what I said I would do? And then you act accordingly. That removes a lot of internal noise, a lot of wasted energy, because you're no longer debating with yourself all the time. You've already decided. Now you're just following through. That's discipline. Not a personality trait, not something you either have or don't. A skill. One that's built through repetition. And like any skill, it feels uncomfortable at the beginning. You'll miss days, you'll slip back into old patterns, you'll have moments where it feels pointless. That's part of it. The goal isn't perfection, it's persistence. Returning to the action even after you've drifted away from it. Because every time you return, you reinforce the pattern again. You remind yourself that this is who you're becoming. Someone who doesn't wait for the perfect moment. Someone who doesn't rely on temporary feelings. Someone who does what needs to be done, even when it's not appealing. That's not extreme. It's just rare. And because it's rare, it creates results that most people don't reach. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't stay consistent long enough to get there. So if you're waiting to feel ready, you'll be waiting for a long time. That feeling doesn't come first. The action does. And once you start acting consistently, even in small ways, something shifts. Discipline stops feeling like force and starts feeling like control. Not control over everything, but control over yourself. And that's where real progress begins.
Chapter 6. The Day You Stop Being Average. It never really arrives the way you imagine it. There's no clean moment, no sudden shift where everything clicks into place and you wake up as a completely different person. Most people wait for something like that anyway. A turning point, a burst of clarity, a version of yourself that finally feels ready.
But life rarely works in that dramatic way. What actually happens is quieter, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention. One day, you do something slightly differently. Not impressive, not life-changing on its own, just different enough to break the usual pattern. You get up when you said you would, even though you didn't feel like it. You start the task instead of postponing it. You pause before reacting the way you always do and choose something else, even if it feels a bit uncertain. Nothing about it feels significant in the moment. In fact, it might feel slightly pointless, like it won't matter either way. That's where most people stop, because the mind doesn't celebrate small shifts. It doesn't send a signal saying, "This is important." It tends to focus on what feels immediate, not what's building quietly underneath. But underneath, something is changing. Slowly, repeatedly. Each time you act differently than your old pattern, you weaken the automatic cycle that used to control your decisions. And each time you return to it, you strengthen a new one. At first, the difference between the two feels almost non-existent. You're still the same person, dealing with the same thoughts, the same resistance, the same doubts. The only difference is how often you listen to them. And that small difference, repeated enough times, starts to reshape how you move through your life. There's a strange moment that eventually shows up. You notice it without planning to. A situation that used to pull you into hesitation doesn't affect you in the same way anymore. The pause is still there, but it's shorter, less convincing. You don't feel forced to act differently. You just do. And that's when it starts to become noticeable. Not to others first, to you. You begin to realize that certain decisions don't carry the same weight they used to. The internal debate gets quieter. The resistance still appears, but it doesn't dominate the outcome like before. It's still there in the background, but now it feels more like noise than instruction. That's the shift. Not becoming a different person overnight, but slowly becoming less controlled by the old one. And somewhere along that process, something else begins to form. A different kind of identity. Not one built on what you think about yourself, but on what you repeatedly do. You stop describing yourself so much. You start demonstrating yourself instead. That change is subtle, but important. Because once your actions begin to contradict your old self-image enough times, that image starts to lose authority. You no longer fully believe every label you once accepted. Not because you forced yourself to think differently, but because experience slowly proved otherwise. There's a kind of tension that comes with this phase. You still remember the old patterns clearly. The hesitation, the avoidance, the comfort of staying within limits that felt safe. But now you also have evidence that you can move beyond them. And those two versions of you begin to compete. One based on familiarity, one based on experience. At first, familiarity tends to win. It's older, deeper, more rehearsed. But experience grows with repetition, and eventually it becomes harder to ignore. You start to trust it more than the old assumptions. That's when average stops being automatic. Not because you've eliminated struggle, but because you've stopped obeying it by default. There's still resistance. There will always be resistance, but it no longer defines the outcome. It becomes something you notice rather than something you follow. And that alone changes the direction of your life more than most people realize. Because average isn't a fixed place. It's a pattern, a collection of decisions that repeat often enough to feel normal. And when those decisions change, even slightly, the direction changes with them. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. There's also something important that doesn't get said enough here. You don't become above average in a sudden leap. You simply stop reinforcing the habits that kept you stuck in a narrow range. That's it. No dramatic transformation required. Just fewer moments of automatic surrender. Fewer times you abandon what matters because it feels inconvenient in the moment. And more moments where you act anyway, even when nothing inside you is pushing you forward. Especially then, because that's where most people give up, and that's exactly where the difference is made. Over time, those choices accumulate, and one day you look back and realize something strange. The life you're living doesn't match the version of you that used to hesitate so often. Not because you became someone else, but because you stopped listening to the parts of yourself that were never fully reliable to begin with. There's no final version of this process, no endpoint where discipline stops mattering or resistance disappears completely. But there is a shift in how it feels. What once required effort becomes familiar. What once felt heavy becomes normal. And what once seemed out of reach starts to look like something you can actually handle. That's the quiet ending of average. Not a dramatic exit, just a gradual departure from the habits that held you there. And when you finally notice it clearly, it doesn't feel like achievement in the loud sense. It feels like clarity. A simple understanding that your life was never fixed. It was shaped, and it can still be shaped further by the choices you continue to make from this point on.